I'm Erin Garner. I'm the General Manager of Occupational Therapy at OT Australia, and I want to wish you all a very happy OT week. I hope you're doing something lovely to celebrate yourselves, your colleagues, and our wonderful profession. I also want to acknowledge the really tough times that we have all been living through over the past few years, be it the pandemic or natural disasters, which are continuing to impact our communities today. These situations take an enormous toll on us personally and also professionally. So I do want to say a big thank you to you all for your ongoing commitment to the profession, your practice, and working with your community so amazingly. I love being an OT and I love watching the contributions that you all make to the people you work with and the lives you change. Have a wonderful OT week and keep up the great work.
Hi everyone, my name is Christina Wyatt and I'm one of the OTs working here at OT Australia. And today I'm very fortunate to be meeting with Toni Knight. Toni is a psychotherapist, author and presenter who specialises in treating burnout, anxiety and trauma. Some of you may remember Toni from her Burnout Hot Topic last year or from the CPD offerings that she provides us on professional resilience. Today, we will explore some of these themes by way of reminding us all of the need to take care of ourselves and of each other. So considering the recent difficult few years that we've all encountered with natural disasters and pandemics and, not to mention the challenges that our work and personal lives continue to present to us, I expect many of us, and myself included, have felt rather wrung out or burnt out. And I know I've had difficulty at times identifying what those signs of burnout are. And I wonder if you could talk us through why it's so difficult to identify burnout and what might we be looking for when we want to accurately identify burnout in either ourselves or in others?
Yeah, look, that is a great question. So just so that we're talking about the same thing, burnout is defined by three groups of symptoms. The first one being symptoms around depletion, so, reduced energy. Next, we've got cynicism, so that feeling of being somewhat disconnected from our purpose, our clients, etc., and that leads to reduced performance, and that's like the third cluster of signs and symptoms of burnout. And yeah, one of the problems in managing burnout is actually being able to identify it. And there's a few reasons why it is quite difficult. I mean, if it was easy to identify, I guess, we'd probably be more on top of this. But as we know, burnout is a really big problem, particularly in what I call compassionate professionals, professional caregivers, if you like, which of course includes OTs. I think that there's a few reasons it's difficult to identify. One of them is because burnout can be quite insidious. It can creep up quite slowly and very stealthily, if I can put it that way. What can happen is that, it can start by looking like you are absolutely crushing it, like you're doing a fantastic job. And so even that alone can be something of an early warning sign that if you are just, making it happen all through the day, and particularly if you're taking work home at night, which I know many OTs do, then, for all the world, it looks like you are doing a tremendous job. But of course, you're really going quite hard, and that's not necessarily sustainable. And so the early warning signs can be quite subtle. And as burnout progresses, unfortunately, our ability to identify it also decreases, because one of the characteristics of burnout is that it reduces our energy and therefore our presence with clients, certainly, but even our presence to be able to kind of check in with ourselves and accurately see what's going on. And of course, in a vicious spiral, increasing burnout means that our capacity to do that becomes less and less. And so it can kind of almost suck us down a plug hole of burnout. And sometimes it's not until the really quite late signs, the really obvious things, that we go, hang on a minute, something is very wrong here. But there's a few other reasons, not just the fact that it's quite insidious and can be quite subtle at first, but I think also we tend to normalize it. And so in professions like OT, you look around and everyone seems to be going through the same thing, and so you can be forgiven for thinking that this is just a normal part of our job. it's not unusual. It doesn't seem unusual. And so that can be certainly a barrier to treating it as well when everyone's going through the same thing. I think too, sometimes our attitudes can play a role. And so we can think sometimes of burnout as being the cost of caring. It's almost like, well, it has to come with the job. You know, if we're going to be compassionate and caring, if we're going to give so much of ourselves to our role, then we have to expect, you know, that burnout is going to be the cost of that. And I think that there's a lot of that attitude among professional caregivers. And I think that it means that we kind of allow burnout to happen to us. And in some cases, you know, I don't want to generalize here, but in some cases, I think it can almost be worn as a badge of honor. It's almost seen as a, you know, a kind of a look how much I care, look how much I give. I'm really burning out. You know, and I'm not suggesting that's true for all of us, but you know, I think I've seen some of those signs in myself in the past. And I think that one of the final reasons I want to mention is that burnout can often be overlooked in a workplace because in some workplaces, and I'd like to think it's a minority of OT workplaces, but in some, to look for burnout, to acknowledge burnout, actually can put us at a real disadvantage. And so there can be some fear, you know, in acknowledging that there is burnout. It's not safe in some workplaces to admit that people are burning out. And I don't think that's always imagined. I think that in some workplaces, unfortunately, the culture is such that it is not safe to admit burnout. And so it's one of those things that we gloss over, we just pretend it's not happening. You know, we tend to take the attitude of, you know, if you can't take the heat, stay out of the kitchen. That kind of attitude. Yeah. Yeah. And so, you know, for all those reasons, it can be difficult to identify. But I think that the way we start to overcome that is, well, first of all, it starts with the workplace leaders, so owners of agencies, supervisors, managers. It really starts there with being willing to look out for it and to reward people for actually, you know, doing something about it, for noticing it, for identifying it. It's very countercultural, and some workplaces just won't be ready to go there, but I do think that, you know, let's not pretend it doesn't exist. It's everywhere. And so the wise leader will be actually looking out for it and being very proactive about managing it. And it starts with leaders because they are the ones that hold the most power. They have access to the resources that OTs need, you know, to not only meet the demands of the role, but to exceed the demands is what we're looking for. And so, you know, within us ourselves, I think it is about looking for the early warning signs and being willing to get on top of it very early on before it progresses, you know. And so early warning signs, as I said, can be really subtle. So it's things like, you know, potentially feeling tired. Now, we do feel tired at the end of the day after a hard day, but are you feeling tired in the mornings when you wake up? You know, that's not good. Are you feeling tired during the day and, you know, finding that you just don't have the energy to sort of get through the day without loads of caffeine or, you know, whatever else it is? So early warning signs, so tiredness, being quite distracted, you know, finding that it's, you know, it's much harder to concentrate, being forgetful. For me, one of my early warning signs is having no sense of humor. So not being able to see the light and the funny side of life. Do you know what I mean? Yes, it doesn't mean that it necessarily is burnout, but certainly if I notice that I'm getting ultra serious all the time, I'd be asking myself the question, you know, what's going on here? Yeah. Being careless, having nights of sleeplessness, you know, maybe not one, but more than one, you know, those are common early warning signs of burnout. They may not necessarily be everybody's signs. And so I think it's important to know your tripwires, as I call them. These are tripwires. And if you notice them, It doesn't mean you have burnout. It means you just need to check into the possibility of burnout. It means that you need to think about your self-care and ask yourself, you know, what's been going on? What do I need to do for myself? And the final thing I want to say about identifying and managing the symptoms of burnout is it's really good once you know your early warning signs to share them with your colleagues. So although we may not notice it in ourselves, we're actually far more likely to notice it in our colleagues, particularly people that we know well, that we work with from day to day. If we see some changes, you know, in our colleagues, it's okay, or it should be okay, to kind of go, just noticing this, you know, how are things going for you? Now, it's not going to be easy to do that unless we give our colleagues explicit permission to ask those questions. Tell them our early warning signs. Say to them, really, I want you to just let me know if you notice this, because I can sort of get on a roll and not notice myself. Please feel free. And when your colleagues do point that out to you, thank them for it.
Yeah.
You know, reward that. What you don't want to do is say, sure, let me know, and then get really grumpy with them for doing it, because they're going to stop. Right?
Yeah, definitely.
So give them permission and thank them when they actually do it. And hopefully this is something you can do for each other.
Yeah. And I love that idea, and I want to maybe explore that a little bit more in later in our chat. But you know, now we have a bit of a clearer picture of what we're looking for when it comes to burnout, what it looks like, how we might be able to identify it more clearly and use others to do that. Can you tell me a little bit about what we can do to maybe counteract it? And I realise this probably is going into the realm of self-care, but I know personally I can find it really hard to think about building self-care in amongst all my various responsibilities, to find that space to do that for myself. And usually I'm prioritising other things ahead of that. And I wondered if you could talk to me a bit about why it's such a challenge for so many of us to prioritise that, and what we can do, or what it might look like for someone who might be saying, right, this is the day I'm going to start prioritising it. How can I build these things in? What does self-care look like for me as I'm starting this journey?
Yeah, yep. So important, Christina. Yeah. And look, you've hit on something really important there, and that is that, like identifying burnout, self-care is also very challenging. Again, it must be. If self-care was really easy, we'd all be doing it, right? So let's acknowledge here that this is not a failing of us personally. Okay, I want to be really clear about that. We can be compassionate, you know, towards ourselves about how hard it is to care for ourselves. It should be the easiest thing in the world, but the truth is that we operate in a system that is largely hostile to self-care. So I don't want to get into a big political discussion about all that, except to say that the larger systems that we find ourselves living in and working in don't reward self-care. All right. So just to give a couple of examples, self-care is not billable as far as I know, and it's not necessarily rewarded. And quite often we don't even get an instant reward for it either. Sometimes if we take a rest or we eat, we can feel a little bit better. But systematic self-care is not something that's actually directly rewarded. And so what happens in the human brain is that we have this thing called a cognitive bias called delayed discounting. And what that says is that the value of good systematic self-care is kind of more vague and felt down in the future when, you know, you're still able to do your job because you've looked after yourself, because you're resilient. But that doesn't feel nearly as rewarding as kind of knocking yourself out now and working super hard and getting that dopamine hit of satisfaction when, you know, you've done a job really well, you've ticked something else off your to-do list. Or if your boss or colleague says, wow, you are really crushing it, Christina. You know what I mean? Like the reward of that is so much clearer, more distinct, and therefore much more reinforcing. And so what we have are systems of work that are kind of short-term, you know, in our thinking, in our rewards. And that's not just within us personally. As I said, that's the largest system that we work in. Yeah. And so what that means in a system that's kind of quite short term, that rewards productivity and crushing it and getting stuff done. And I'm not saying that those things are bad, by the way. You know, they are obviously good things, but this is about, you know, weighing it up against other values. It's not the only value. It's not the only thing that matters. And everybody, 100% of people listening to this would say, well, yes, of course my well-being matters. Of course self-care matters. But we are contending with that system that rewards really sacrificing ourselves, making ourselves martyrs for our cause. We know it. We do it. I do it too. And so, you know, where uber productivity is rewarded, not just personally by us, but by other people, you know, by, you know, NDIS and funding systems, what it means is that self-care becomes a pretty radical thing if we're doing it systematically. So yes, when we get exhausted, we will need to sleep. When we get hungry, we will need to eventually eat something, right? And other forms of self-care as well. I'm talking about really systematic, proactive self-care is a radical act in a system that doesn't really reward it. And so, you know, and in some workplaces, obviously, you know, there's not even a great deal of opportunity to do that self-care. So it's not just that it's not rewarding, it's actually not even possible in some workplaces, right? And so once again, being systematic about self-care becomes quite countercultural, quite a radical act. And so what I would say is that, you know, it is about weighing up the values and asking yourself the simple question, how does my health and well-being stack up against my reputation in my workplace? You know, so we need to somehow find a way to, you know, bring back those values that we kind of tend to not prioritize. Because let's face it, we can get away with, you know, pulling an all-nighter or, you know, taking a lot of work home. And I think all of us have probably done that before for various reasons. But if we keep doing it, if we keep prioritizing productivity over health, and sometimes you can have both, and that's why we do it, because we kind of in the short term can get away with it, but that's not sustainable, obviously. And so ultimately we have to go, okay, you know, one is going to come at the cost of the other. What if I could have both? What if I could be, you know, certainly efficient in what I do, but be willing to find some kind of useful trade-off between productivity and my well-being, and value both of those things.
It's important for us to not forget that, particularly when we have then these extraneous factors like a COVID pandemic or something come in and put an extra layer of pressure on us.
Yes.
To have those systems in place means then we'll be best placed to sort of deal with those possible extra, you know, pressures that life can very easily throw at us.
Right. It's never just work, is it? I mean, there's always other stuff going on. And, you know, on top of that, yeah, you add a pandemic. I mean, there are a lot of demands placed on us. And to think that it could be anything like business as usual would be completely unrealistic. I think perhaps for many of us, we underestimated the impact that the pandemic has had on our resources. You know, it's very, very demanding, more demanding. And if you think about demands and resources as being a simple equation, you know, in order for our work to be sustainable, our resources need to exceed our demands, right? Yes. At the simplest level. Well, you know, the pandemic added a whole other batch or level, if you like, of demands that our resources may not have been able to actually account for and manage, you know. And of course, then we've got our life circumstances, you know, the other stuff that happens outside of work can place demands on us as well. We need the personal and occupational or workplace resources to manage all of that, and then some.
And if you're thinking about starting a self-care journey, I think you and I spoke before this meeting and it was such a great insight for me, but you gave some great tips about things that you could just do, just very small but very quick things that you can start building into your daily life or into your just everyday interactions with work or other people who might be requiring something of you. Do you want to just give us some ideas of what that might look like? Toni?
Yeah, so just to really simplify all that, I would say think about power, people, and purpose. If you want to just talk about 3 Ps, power is about energy. And so if you notice that your energy is low, you're going to need, you need energy. I talk about energy as being our gold. And so it's not just, power or energy. It's not just about rebuilding those, but asking ourselves the question, where are my biggest drainers? Am I doing things for others that I don't necessarily need to do? And it's not to say we don't want to necessarily be completely selfish, but what I know of OTs is that you are very giving people, and quite often at great personal expense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And so this is about, when you think about power or energy, I think of it as the currency of burnout. It's asking yourself some serious questions, big picture, certainly, but even in the day-to-day, asking yourself questions. Do I need to spend my precious gold on doing that particular thing? Is that going to be enough payoff? Do I need to say no to some more requests for my time and energy? And the other side of that, of the power side, of course, is, as we said, the rebuilding. And so it's not just enough to get a good sleep at night and to even have evenings to yourself. You actually need to have that rebuilding time regularly throughout your day if you really want to perform at your best. And I know in some workplaces that's really tough. I've talked to some pediatric OTs, for example, who, in that very, very small amount of time in between client sessions, they are expected to do notes, to clean equipment, to then get set up for the next client. And this is often while they're talking to parents or other people, and I know that, in different branches of OT, they have their own demands, but it does make it very difficult to kind of find time to rest and recoup in between client sessions when there's so much going on.
Yes.
I don't have a simple answer to that. But I would say to people that this is going to be about not only looking into ourselves and asking how we can change that, but working with our employers as well. As I said, they actually hold all the power here and can make the changes. But, I mentioned the other 2 Ps, and that's people and purpose. So I think that, people, and we'll talk about this in just a moment in more depth because it's so important, and that is recognizing that resilience is a team sport, right? We can't do it on our own. It's crazy to think of doing it on our own. We need each other. We need to connect. So I'll come to that, in just a moment. But, and the third one is purpose. And again, this comes back to the values that we were talking about, asking ourselves, what is more important right now? What seems more important is on our to-do list. Is it really? Can it wait? And so sometimes it's about making a series of small decisions about what we spend our precious gold on throughout the day. And look, there's lots of other things as well I could add there, but that's kind of a good, it's a reasonable starting point. Yeah. Yeah. So
I love that. Yeah, no, I just wanted to say I love that idea about it being part of your purpose and part of the people around you. And I think that certainly feels to me like a shift in the way we think about self-care, because as you mentioned in your, when you discussed burnout, often when we're thinking about our self-care or our well-being, it's very much an individual journey and very much an individual process. But your suggestion is that actually, no, we have a team that need to be involved in this process. It's a team sport. It's something we do as a collective. And I wondered if you might be able to just maybe dig into that a bit more as you talk about people and as you talk about the self-care pathway. What might a collective or a community approach to wellness or to self-care look like? You spoke about leaders, but I'm sure there's many other people in that space that we can think about building into that collective.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of my favorite things to talk about, is this idea that, we should never, ever think of self-care or resilience as, an individual pursuit. I mean, obviously, we do need to make some individual decisions about what matters more and, when we need to take rest, etc. But, you know, it is so much easier to do as a collective, as a team. And so, you know, I'll throw a few ideas in here about how that might look, but obviously it's going to be different in each workplace. And I guess I want to start by also acknowledging that some OTs operate very independently, either because they might be self-employed solo contractors, or they have community-based positions where they're out moving a lot of the time. There's a whole lot of people who operate fairly autonomously. And so they are especially challenged, I think, to think about how they can work as part of a team as well. It is possible. And look, ideally, it is a whole team. But as I say to people, even just having one other person, ideally a colleague, another OT who kind of knows what it's like, one other person can make such a difference to your well-being. And there's really good research around that demonstrates that. But when you think about it, it's kind of logical, isn't it? And so, you know, working together and supporting each other could be everything from collective action on the system itself. So, you know, like making changes, you know, to the bigger system is certainly possible. It has to start with someone, but it's going to be more effective as a team. But if you come down to the level of the workplace, right, there's not much point in kind of just passively complaining about workplace conditions if they're not conducive to well-being. I say to, you know, to employees that, you know, this is about working with the employer. There's growing legislation, certainly codes of practice in parts of Australia now, that are becoming more and more specific about the kinds of practices workplaces need to put in place in order to honour the psychosocial health and well-being of their people. And so it's worth looking to national and state legislation and codes of practice to see what's there. But these are things that can only be implemented as a team. Certainly the employer has control and power, but they can't do it on their own, and they're not going to do a very good job on their own either. I know that if my employer was making decisions about my workplace with regard to my well-being, I would certainly hope that they would have me very actively involved, at the very least consulting with me to help identify the main hazards, you know, as regards burnout and compassion fatigue, and getting my suggestions about what I need, the resources I need to put things in place. And so again, it's a team effort. But even as you come down to even more informal sources of support, you know, peer support is one of those things that, you know, I think is not utilized enough, I think. And peer support can be formalized, you know, like regular paid sessions where, you know, you actually, you know, get to, you know, debrief with a colleague and potentially talk about strategies and hold each other accountable and support each other in putting self-care strategies in place in the workplace. But of course, most peer support is going to be informal. It's the kind of thing that builds social capital and can build culture as well. So, you know, if you're unhappy with the way your workplace is currently, sure, you can feel empowered to go individually to your supervisor or employer and talk about it, but it's going to be so much better to do it as a team. So it's not just you. And this is particularly true for workplaces where perhaps leadership is ignorant of, or perhaps even hostile towards the idea of making these kinds of changes. As I said, I think it's a minority, but they do exist. And so coming together with your fellow employees to talk about how the workplace could be, how resources could be increased in order to get your work done is much, much better than trying to tackle this on your own. And finally, I would just say there that, you know, also as a group, you can decide that unsafe work practices are an absolute no. So whether a boss notices it or not, you decide as a group that, you know, you are going to speak out and support each other against things like discrimination, exclusion, incivility in the workplace, even aggression. Unfortunately, it still happens. And, you know, I get that when people are stressed out and in what I call the red zone, they can be quite reactive, impulsive, and say and do things that are potentially out of character. Even so, we shouldn't as a group, turn a blind eye to that. It still needs to be called out, even if the person who's being incivil or aggressive, even if they need additional support. It's perhaps one of those early warning or even not so early warning signs of burnout. And so we can't just ignore it or go, oh, they're just having a bad day. This person may be in need of support. They might be burning out. And as a group, I think it's great to come together to say those kinds of things are not acceptable in a psychologically safe workplace. We're going to call them out, but not in a mean way, not in an accusatory way, but more in a, look, this isn't really you. You know, can we support you? Can we help you in some way? Because it sounds like you need it.
Yeah. I love that idea. I feel like we need to do that more with each other in all sort of ways as well, not just in our workplace and thinking about our kind of work roles, but even in our sort of relationships with friends and family, that we sort of have this agreement that we all can say, I see things aren't quite as they should be, or I sense something's a little bit more pressuring you, or you're struggling a bit, what can I do to support you? Yeah,
I think that what that does is that it's extending goodwill to a person whose behaviour perhaps hasn't been great. And so we're not excusing the behaviour, but we're not assuming that they're just a bad person or that they're being horrible or what have you. And it's easy when we're burning out, by the way, to make those assumptions. That's a sign. If our goodwill is starting to dry up, that might be something to have a look at ourselves. But as you rightly say, Christina, just looking at the behaviour for what it is and seeing it as a symptom of something rather than something that is personal to whoever said or did it.
Absolutely. I love that. Thank you so much, Toni, for taking us through all these important topics today. I feel like it's so important that we come back and revisit these points from time to time. I mean, particularly after we've had the tumultuous few years that we've all lived through. And I really want to just extend an encouragement out to everyone listening to this today to take time to reflect on what they need to do when they're looking at themselves insofar as burnout signs, insofar as their supports that they need around them, and thinking about the self-care, the systemic self-care that you can start to build into your life, instead of it being a tokenism every now and then when things are really starting to get a bit difficult and exhausting. And I particularly want to encourage everyone to think about this collective approach to self-care. Think about the supports and the people around you can build in to build this collective approach. So thank you so much, Toni. You've done an amazing job of taking us through that today, and I thank you very much.
My absolute pleasure, Christina. I wish you and your members all the very best.